Charlie Byrd. Welcome to my video. In this video, I hope to talk about improvisation mostly, and especially improvisation as it applies to fingerstyle guitar, or a guitarist with some classical technique, or maybe a pick player that's converting to using his fingers more. And I'll try to show you some of the things that I've found that work on this instrument. As far as I'm concerned, improvisation is a very important part of my musical life. To me, I like the analogy that improvising is conversation, and memorizing a piece, whether it's your piece or someone else, is like memorizing a poem and saying it in public. And both are wonderful ways to make music, and I don't think any musician should be without both of those ways. I certainly do recommend that any guitarist learn to arrange music for the guitar. And this will be a subject I will take up more in another video, I hope. But in this one, we're going to talk mostly about improvisation. Some of the same things apply, however, so you will not be without some information that you can use in your arranging. The piece that I've opened this with was what I consider one of the very important chord progressions that a guitarist should know. And that's like basically it was a little improvisation based on a 2-chord, a 5-chord, and a 1-chord in the key of G, which is to say an A minor 7th, a D 7th, and a G major. And the G major can be 6th or major 7th, and even sneak in a G sharp occasionally and make it an E 7th in the inversion to get back to the A minor. And then I had a bridge with it that's sort of like the traditional rhythm bridge. In other words, it went to B7, E7, A7, and D7. And I showed you some different ways to go at it. I started with an ad-lib way, and then I went into tempo and explored a few different ideas for keeping a tempo as a solo instrumentalist. I think that in order to acquire technique to improvise, you need to have a facility with single note playing or scale playing, and that involves most efficiently, I think, learning to alternate the first and second as well as the other combinations of your fingers. In other words, the first and second finger should not generally repeat when you're playing a scale. The right hand is not doing its best when it's doing that. It should be. That's the way that the master classical guitarists do it, and I think that's the way that it's done most effectively. The other technique is the arpeggio, which is one string at a time across the strings. That was a group of 4, but there are also groups of 3. There are 2 pieces of literature that I think you could have in your library that would help you in these 2 endeavors. The first would be Andres Segovia's major scales. His fingerings of these scales is a must, I think, for guitarists. There are many ways to finger any scale, but Segovia's way has a wonderful logical place for all the shifts, and he shows you the various right-hand fingerings that you should use, and he goes through all 24 keys, that is, major and minor, in all 12 key signatures. For the arpeggios, I could recommend 120 short arpeggio studies by Mario Giuliani. And these are very basic things. The little arpeggios that go like what you do with them after you have learned all the different 120 permutations that Mario thought of, what you do with them in using them in modern playing is to shift the position of those. You know, you can have, for example, you can have an arpeggio that's but if you do that arpeggio and you break it up and shift it like this, much more interesting, makes a much more interesting melodic pattern. And the arpeggio is what comes very natural to the guitar. If you just, that's an arpeggio. So the guitar plays arpeggios very easily in either direction. So I think it's something that a guitarist should not neglect. The scale idea is that's the hard part of guitar technique, and every guitarist needs to spend some time on that, I think, because it is the hardest part. It's the unnatural thing for the guitar because of the way the guitar is tuned with the in fourths except for one, so that makes our scales come out in much more erratic positions than they do for other instruments, and it's valuable for guitarists to spend some time and learn all of these little idiosyncrasies of the way a scale has to be played on the guitar and use that to your advantage rather than being a victim of it and not being able to get over it quickly. The best guitarists are able to use the way the scale forms on the guitar and make good musical sense out of it. I'm going to break down some of the progressions I was using in the first piece at this point and show you some of the things that I think it would be valuable for you to master. For instance, the progression that I was using, which is a 2-5-1 progression, starting on A minor, going to D7th, and then to some form of a G major. You should be able to play that anywhere on the guitar. And for instance, to start at one of the highest places you could do it, the A minor 7th would be like that, and then the D7th. A minor 7th again, into G6, then A minor 7th again, D minor 7th, G minor 7th, G minor 6th, A minor 6th, D7th, you should practice that I was doing it on the first 4 strings. You should do it on all combinations. And you should be able to play 7th chords. And when I say 7th chords, what I mean is a 4-note chord. A 4-note chord. And you can play, mostly try to play them complete, but you can leave out notes, especially in an improvisation you can. Harmony, any harmony, whether it be the pattern we just played or some that we'll come to later, harmony is generally played in either 4 or 3-note patterns. A guitar can play up to 6-note chords, and we do that for special emphasis. But you don't think in terms of 6-part harmony on the guitar. You think in terms of 3-part harmony or 4-part harmony, or even 2-part harmony, and thirds are thirds with one double. All of these are very important parts of the harmony that we'll be coming back to later. Continuing with the idea of the 2-7, 5-7, 1 progression that we were in, I'd like to show you a little bit of how to treat the final bar, a couple of options on how to get back in to the first part of the pattern. In other words, we have an A minor, and we have a D7th, and we have a G. And now we're going back to the A minor, and there are a couple of ways to do that. Now the first way, one of the best ways, is to chromaticize this progression a little bit and go A minor, D7, G, and then a G sharp in the bass. Makes that an E7th with a G sharp in the bass, and then back to the A minor and D7 and the G. And another way to do it would be to go to the B flat minor 7th. In other words, the G major 7th is very much like the B minor 7th, half step down, and another half step, and you're at A minor. That can also be played here. Or, in other words, you could go or that's exactly the same. Or an octave higher. You need to know all of this stuff. That's two very good ways to get back to the A minor. And there are even more, but that's as far as we'll go with that. And I'd like to also talk a little more about how you get the sound from the guitar. We talked about scale strokes, and I recommended the Segovia scales, and the arpeggios recommended Giuliani. There are several other ways to get sound out of the guitar. One, the English calls hammers and snaps, which is to play a note and play the second note with your left hand. Or if the note is higher, to actually pluck it off, pull it off. People, some of the rock stars have turned this to the electric guitar and become millionaires doing things like that. But you can do it with the acoustic guitar as well. That's that's called a trill, but a slur is what Segovia calls it. Calls that. The simplest slur exercise is this one. You start and do a chromatic. And then come down. That's the simplest one. My favorite for the guitarist who is accomplished and knows how to play already, my favorite is to use a scale for that purpose. Let's think in terms of a D scale, a D chord here. A D scale, but we're starting on A. In other words, we go. You notice I didn't slur between the strings. On some situation, some circumstances, you can do that. But I'm plucking those that I have to. And then ascending. Up and down, and you should do that all over the place. And in thirds, in triplets. Etc. There are a million little exercises that you can make up. I love to practice, and I love to make up exercises to practice. That's one of the joys of playing the guitar for me. I work out my problems, and I get my fingers to work better by inventing little exercises of my own. And any of these suggestions that I make to you should be understood as a starting point for you to invent your own exercise. For example, the piece that I played in the key of G, you should play in every key, or at least in the major keys that you use when you play the guitar. You should certainly do it in the key of that 2-5-1 progression. You should certainly practice it in the key of G and D, C and F, and perhaps B flat as well. The other way of getting a sound from the guitar that I want to discuss a little bit before we go further is the rascato, or the strum. Now I have, the most useful strum I have is something that I'd learned from my pick playing days, and it's not something that the classical guitarist uses very often, and that is straight up and down with the finger, using the finger. My index finger, I use sometimes others, but the index finger as a pick, as I would a pick. And I use that sort of a roll effect like that. Or I have a little thing where I use my middle finger on the side and gets a softer effect where I can do a long, continuous, sustained roll. Very effective. It's not unlike the whole violin section does a tremolo with their bows, and it's particularly good for accompanying other people. It sounds very good behind other instruments soloing, and it does give the guitar the opportunity to get a very sustained effect that it isn't ordinarily able to do over long 4, 8, 16 bar phrases. Other uses of this same strum, and this I recommend to pick players very much, is to use it in order to play accents. In other words, you use your up and down stroke in order to put the accent in a particular place in the bar. I'm going to show you an illustration, a one bar thing first, as it's found in the bossa nova, the one bar, with the accents on the downbeat and on the upbeat of 2 and on the 4th beat. And that's very easily accomplished this way because that is really dividing the 8 parts that you get when you divide a bar into 8th notes into a 3, and a 2. In other words, a 3 is down, up, down, and a 2 is down, up. So if you go, that's 2 3s and a 2, which totals 8. And if that downbeat gives you that accent every time. That particular thing doesn't sound much like bossa nova, because bossa nova's guitar players don't fill in all the beats, but they are the accents. Let's do it one other way, and that is to put the 2 in front and the and followed by the 2 3s. In other words, I'm going to illustrate a 2-bar pattern, the first bar being 3 3 2, and the second bar being 2 3 3, and it'll sound something like this. I think, just as a sideline, for the pick players, you should also practice that on a single note with the pick, because it's really a good way to play a long rhythmic phrase, and you can invent your own, any combination that you want to, by simply knowing exactly how you're going to pick it, and you have the feel for it, and you get your accent straight. So many pick guitar players of my generation did up and down strokes religiously, and they tried to learn how to play the strong accent with an upstroke and things like that. But this very old-fashioned way puts the rhythm straight. It makes it just the way you want it without even thinking about it. Just a little more talk about the rascato. I've found in my early days, I tried to dabble in flamenco a little bit, and I learned a few of the flamenco guitarist tricks, and I found that I can use some of these tricks in my playing, especially for a strong roll effect and things like that. I have this little thing that Carlos Ramos showed me, four-stroke roll with the right hand, in which you start with the index finger, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, and repeat that. Or doing it faster. And this is something it's not something you use in every jazz piece, but I'm able to use it. But the idea that I'm trying to get across for the rascato is to learn this idea of the 2 being up and down and the 3 being down, up, down. And it's a rhythmic device that's very natural to the guitar and that gets good effect. One other little illustration before I move on to something else is I'd like to show you how you can use that to do a 6/8 bar and a 3/4 bar, which you run into in Latin American music a lot. In other words, if you consider that in 3/4 time, you would be thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and for 6 beats, and in 6/8 time, you would be thinking. By how you strum that with your right hand, you make that a perfectly easy thing to do. I'm going to move on next, and I'm going to start a new segment of this video by playing some blues in the key of A. some blues. The blues is the mother lode of popular music. I used to say in this country, but it's worldwide. You hear the Japanese and the Irish and everybody is using the blues as a foundation of music. And I've always been involved with the blues. My father was a very good blues guitar player. He didn't play the guitar very much. He played the mandolin mostly, but when he played the guitar, he played the blues very well. What I just tried to illustrate was really two different basic kinds of blues. The first one was a very churchy oriented progression that involves, in the key of A, which is what I was in, an A chord, and then a quick dominant, and then an A7, a D, a D sharp diminished, back to A, F sharp 7th, D 7th, dominant 7th, E, and then A. As I was improvising, I worked my way into the more conventional contemporary blues, which is when you start on the A to the D, the 12-bar blues that everyone knows and loves so much. All the boogie-woogie tunes were based on that. 2/3 of Count Basie's arrangements are based on that. A high percentage of Duke Ellington pieces are based on that. And it's very prominent in rock and roll as well. Another thing I did in that little improvisation was to start with a single note. And I did that because I wanted to point out to players that you don't have to play full harmony all the time. If you start with one note or you go to single line or very sparse harmony during a piece, that makes the harmony that you play when you're coming in much more pronounced and much more effective to the person that's hearing it. And that's what we are here to do, and that is to make our music effective and make it entertaining to the people that hear us and to ourselves who are playing it as well. I'm going to stick with the blues a little bit longer and illustrate a couple of other things that interest me about the guitar. I have been the past few years been exploring the harmony in the lower end of the guitar. It's something I neglected in my earlier playing, and I didn't know as much as I needed to know about that part of the guitar, so I've been doing more playing down low. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how wonderful these dark chords sound down here. That to me as a whole, it's a new experience for me, and I certainly recommend that you give that some thought. Another aspect of those chords, whether I'm playing them down there or not, is I have tried to work out chord progressions that have a tenth between the root of the chord and the melody. In other words, this idea. If you'd like to harmonize a scale, for example, in the key of G that I was just in, using all seventh chords. Let's just do that just for fun. And this would be like G major seventh, C minor seventh, D minor seventh, C major seventh, D seventh, E minor seventh, the half diminished, which is on the seventh step, and the G major seventh again, and then keep inverting it. C major seventh, D seventh, and resolve that to G major seventh. Those are all the seventh chords as they occur in the major key with no alterations. Now descending, I like to do this little exercise, which is using these same chords but in a progression that goes by fourths. In other words, start with the G major seventh, and in the closest place that you can possibly get it, go to a C major seventh. You could go to the root position, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go to everything by step. In other words, this is G major seventh, going to a C major seventh, and the fourth step away is the F sharp half diminished, and that goes to B minor seventh, E minor seventh, A minor seventh, D seventh, G major seventh, C minor seventh, F sharp half diminished, B minor seventh, E minor seventh, A minor seventh, D seventh, G major seventh, C major seventh, D half diminished, B minor seventh, E minor seventh, A minor seventh, D seventh, G major seventh, C minor seventh, half diminished, and B minor seventh. And that's the lowest chord you can play on the guitar. That's a very nice sounding progression. And the wonderful thing about that is that it doesn't change key, and you can use segments of that. You know, you can break that up into 3 chord progressions or 4 chord progressions. Another harmonic aspect that I shouldn't leave undone, and I'll do a little blues using this one too, is one that was so wonderfully explored by Wes Montgomery. That's the octave. Now the octave for a finger player is a little bit different idea, because we can actually strum the octaves, play them simultaneously, whereas Wes did it with a pick over the other string, and it got a very nice little broken effect there. But the beauty of the octave is that if you're playing with other people, the octave doesn't spell out any harmony of its own. So using an octave in your line allows the bass player or the piano player, whoever is playing with you, to express any kind of harmony without coming in conflict with it. Now, the fingering of octaves on the finger style, you can use the octave that is 2 strings apart like this, whereas with a pick, you need to most of the time you finger it this way or that way, because it's much easier, and it's too hard to try to jump over all those strings with the pick. But it's perfectly good finger style. A little blues and octaves. You should learn to do that in all keys. One more harmonic device that I want to talk about, and this is I'm going to talk about in connection with the bossa nova, which I'm going to illustrate in the next segment. This is the idea of using three-part harmony against the pedal. In Latin music, you use this sort of vamp, one chord or even two chord idea a lot of times for the improvisation. You hear them play the tune, and then we'll go into a one chord idea and vamp and play that for 30 minutes if you feel like it. What I'd like to interest you in is using the guitar in an open position so that you can have an open string to play the harmony against, and an occasional change of bass note, and using triads against that foundation. Now, what this progression involves a G scale, but a D minor is predominantly a D minor chord with an occasional reference to a G7th. And you can use all of the triads in that scale. So you use D minor, G, A minor, B half diminished, C, D minor, E minor, F, and G. Now if you put that against the bass note, you can expand that idea a little bit and break away from the triads and do chords in fourths. I think the trick is to stay within the scale. Avoid those chromatic notes when you're doing that kind of thing, because that's like, it becomes playing tennis without a net. You know, you need some sort of guidance, and I think the thing that makes that all work is the fact that the ear gets focused on that pedal tone and those chords that are going over it. Let's talk about the bossa nova a little bit. Everything I know about the bossa nova I learned from Laurindo Almeida and from listening to João Gilberto. I think João Gilberto comps behind bossa nova better than anybody, and he's not a virtuoso guitarist in many ways, but he does that impeccably. No one ever did it better than him. And his rhythm is basically very simple that he does with his right hand. He generally plays seventh chords. He doesn't always alternate the bass. Sometimes he plays the same bass note repeated. As a matter of fact, I would say more often than not he does. And the fingers, the chord part, in addition to the bass, is following the same pattern that I talked about earlier. In other words, if you think of the rhythm of the 16 beats in a two-bar phrase, 16 eighth notes covering 2 bars, if you think of dividing those 16 beats into anything but 4 even ones, you know, because if you just played that's not bossa nova at all. It doesn't have that, the feeling of that. So you need to break those top chords into groups of 3s and 2s. And if you get out your pencil, you can see how many permutations there are. There can be there can be 2 groups of 3 in each measure and 1 group of 2. That's the only way that that can work out. So yeah, out of that 2 bars, you have 2 beats figures and 4 3-beat figures, and you can rearrange them in any way you want to. Now, in an arrangement, you certainly would be dictated by the melody to some extent how you did that. But if you're just jamming and you're playing a bossa nova rhythm behind it, you have the option of moving that around a little bit. Generally speaking, you alternate the 2. In other words, the first bar is, that would be that way of doing it. Once again. The thumb, the bass note is on the first beat and the third beat all the time. My friend Charles Gilberto doesn't even allow a bass player to go. He doesn't like that for his very subtle accompaniments. He wants to speed it up a little bit and to play a progression with it. That's about what it is. Now, when you're playing a melody, or when you're improvising a melody, sometimes you might break your bass pattern. I do, certainly. But I always have it in mind and come back to it. And you could even get back to that first idea I was saying, and that is to put the accent in the bass. That, with any combination of rest, is pretty much how you comp to the bossa nova. You can also do the strum as I was doing before. I even worked out a little thing where I worked in a finger tap to go with that. Let me see if I can think of that. Little invention of my own there. I never heard Gilberto do that. He doesn't do anything that raucous. He's such a gentle soul. like to talk a little bit more about the bossa nova and about some of the ideas that I've used in this piece. I'm sure that you guitarists noticed that this piece is based on a chromatic chord progression in the key of C, and it started on a C and then went to a B, more or less a B seventh. They could all be sevenths. In this progression, they could all be sevenths that way, and it starts on the tonic and goes down to the dominant, the fifth. But it's also interesting to use alternate major seventh and then seventh with the suspension, if you like. Major seventh, sixth, suspension to the seventh. I think that makes it a little more sophisticated, and it makes it a little more musical than just a straight Hawaiian guitar sort of progression that comes down in half steps. And the other thing that I tried to do in that piece was to have the melody that I played in the beginning there be an ascending melody so far as possible. And I started here and went up to the B there, and then, in other words, the chord's coming down, the melody's going up. That's an idea that in composition or in improvising sort of keeps you out of trouble. As long as you can manage that, the harmony usually sounds good, even if you run into conflicting notes. If they're going in opposite directions, they usually sound perfectly fine. The other idea for making a progression such as this sound good is to give a common tone. And the common tone that works best, I think, in this particular progression is the dominant note, the G. In other words, you could play this whole progression and keep that G. You've heard songs that use that idea a lot, but it certainly is a good idea to use in improvisation. And the sixth step is another one that works very well. Also works very well. I had just finished playing a concert in Sao Paulo, in which I included quite a bit of bossa nova music, and a gentleman came up to me with about a 2-inch stack of sheet music and gave it to me, and it was old music from Brazil. And he didn't say very much. He said, "This is a gift for you," but I think the message he was trying to give me was, "Young fellow, if you want to play Brazilian music, you should know this." And I took it to heart. I brought those pieces home. It was music by Ernesto Nazaré, music by Pixinguinha and Pernambuco and other classic Brazilian guitarists in the past, and later recorded much of that music with my friend Lorindo Almeida. And I think that was a good parallel to my whole musical experience, in which in the beginning, when I first learned about jazz, it was about the late swing and bebop era. And as a kid, I didn't pay much attention to Louis Armstrong and the earlier jazz people, but I found it very valuable to go back and listen to Muddy Waters and Louis Armstrong and Blind Lemon Jefferson and people like that, because they are what blues and jazz music is all about. And in the same way, these Brazilian musicians of the past are very much a part of what contemporary Brazilian music is. So when you're learning to play rhythms, don't neglect the basic Brazilian forms and the Brazilian rhythmic patterns. Pichinguinha and Nazaré, their form is very much like the old polka and march forms. In other words, there'll be a theme and a second theme, followed by a trio, and the rhythms will go. Pichinguinha had very inventive and complicated bass lines. I'm not going to try to get involved in a lot of that. But go back and learn the simplest Latin forms as well as the complex new bossa nova hip ones. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about playing harmonics on the guitar. The natural harmonics are at the octave. You also have a very nice strong one at the 7th fret, which gives you the 5th away, and you have the 2nd octave. A little bit from those notes at the 9th fret and the 4th fret, which are the same notes again. What's happening when you're playing octaves, I don't know if guitarists have all thought about it, but you are dividing the string into exactly equal vibrating parts. In other words, this harmonic divides that one into an octave, and this divides it into thirds, and that divides it into fourths. You can incorporate these kind of things in your playing. I've used harmonics very effectively, mixing them with full chords, like, you call that a G chord. And a wonderful device, harmonic is a wonderful device for having something sustained under you. You have your own violin section playing something behind you as you play it. That wonderful use of harmonics that way. No, on the acoustic guitar, no harmonic lasts and rings as well as the natural ones. But we do know how to play harmonics in other ways, and that is to cut the string in half with this hand. In other words, touch the string with the classical players touch the string with the index finger and pluck it with the finger behind. That allows you to play a harmonic on any note melodically. You have to finger the same note here as you're doing here. And once you do that, you can do all kinds of things with it. You can even bend the notes as in the blues. Very good use of the harmonic, and with a little practice, you can add a whole lot of range to your guitar, and you can add a whole lot of variety to the sounds that you get for the guitar. You can also use a double octave. I didn't point that out because that's very treacherous, but it can be done. You can hear by some of those funny notes how treacherous it is. The other possibility, one of the other possibilities, is to combine the natural notes with the harmonic notes. And this is something that Segovia did very well in some of his transcriptions. In other words, you play the top note and you add lower notes. And you make the chord fuller that way. That's a possibility. You can also combine harmonics and regular notes in a melodic fashion. In other words, you could play without changing position. You could play an arpeggio that goes like that. Harmonics is not something that's very difficult to do on the guitar, but it does require a little practice to get them headed in the right direction and to get your confidence built up so that you can use them, especially in improvising, because you have to use so many parts of your body. You have to use your eyes and both hands in order to make just one harmonic note. I'd like to talk a little bit about parallel harmony on the guitar, which is a natural and easy thing to do and can be very effective, used sparingly, I think. Lorendo Almeida, who I refer to often as a friend of mine, was a master at thinking of different ways to use these chromatic ideas. Chromatic harmony seems to work best when there's a 10th or a 6th involved between the notes. What I mean is something like, even if it's a chord in, for like a 6/9 chord like this. And you can use the exact same fingering, so you can do little tricks like sounds like pretty good harmony for a while. You can also do it with this kind of chord, like a 6 chord. Hawaiian guitar. But it sounds perfectly acceptable, and you can do some very nice things. You can do 7th chords. Things like that. You can, I'm sure, think of some good ideas like that for yourself. We're getting near the end, and I'm going to close this segment with a different kind of chord progression. We began with a chord progression of 2-5-1. We went through a chromatic progression in the bossa nova. We played the blues, and for the final section, I'm going to play in the key of C, and I'm going to do changes that begin on 1 and goes 1, 6, 2, 5, and back to 1, and then has a bridge that starts on C7, F, D7, and G. That's also a very useful progression and one that you'll find in many, many standard songs as well as many contemporary songs. It's been a great pleasure doing this video for you, and I appreciate your watching it, and I hope that I've been able to give you some ideas. In my opinion, the whole idea of teaching is to teach you to teach yourself. And if I've clicked a few things over in your mind there, I'm very happy. Good night.